All right, our first question is, why does Jesus give us 66 extra verses? All right, it's a curious question, but you'll see what I mean as we go along. Jesus uses the 28 verses in Matthew 24 to answer the Matthew 24:3 questions where his disciples asked him questions. But then after he's answered the questions, he uses another 66 verses extra to talk about something else. So he answers their questions because they asked him questions. In Matthew 24:3, it says, "Tell us, what will be the sign of your coming, Jesus, and the end of the age?" So Jesus answers question A and B by the end of verse 28, and then he continues for another 66 verses. So what is the point of the extra 66 verses? Well, we're going to see it after a while. In a nutshell, Jesus is saying, when I die in 3 days, and the way you know that he's going to die in 3 days is that in chapter 26 of Matthew, it begins with, "And he said to his disciples, you know that after 2 days is the Passover." So this Matthew 24:25 dissertation is Jesus giving his last appeal to his 12 disciples, and therefore having it captured in Scripture and giving it to everybody for 2,000 years. This is the most urgent, most important thing Jesus can say to you before he leaves the scene and dies and goes to heaven. And you know, this is it. This is like the Magna Carta. This is like the Declaration of Independence. This is a critically important document. So what he's saying is, when I die 3 days from now, I want all my servants, my faithful servants, to remember that they must live daily in a so-doing mode. And I've called it that because in a little while you'll see him use a couple of scriptures to talk about blessed are those who are found so doing, and really he expands on it as we go through Matthew 26. So Matthew 24:46 says, "Blessed is the servant whom his master when he comes will find so doing." Now the verse before verse 46 is complicated, and we messed with it a little bit last night in the Bible study. We're going to focus on the so-doing mode later, but first we need to study what comes before it, and that was Jesus answering the question. And knowing that he'd be dead in 3 days, he wanted to A, get their questions answered, and then B, go on to the 3 golden keys of the so-doing mode. Now, for 40 years or so of my life in the church, I have just read verse after 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 verse, and I don't sort of diagram it out. I don't read the section and then stop and meditate on first section. But if you look closely, you can see the end of first section is verse 14. Now, first Jesus uses verse 4 through 14 to answer question A, which is, what is the sign of the end of the age? Matthew 24:14, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world. Has that happened yet? Anybody think that's happened yet? Anybody think that hasn't happened yet? Raise your hand if you don't think it's happened yet. Right? Herbert Armstrong talked about doing it, but actually never got it done. It says, preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. Now, it's the gospel of the kingdom. It's not the gospel of going to heaven when you die. How many of you think the gospel of going to heaven when you die has been pretty much preached in all the world? Now, maybe not to the Chinese. I mean, some Chinese know it. You know, maybe not to the Mongolians, but you know, and maybe some tribes in Africa or someplace. But pretty much on every continent, the gospel of give your heart to Jesus and go to heaven when you die has been preached, but that's not what he's saying. He's saying this gospel, the gospel that he and the apostles were teaching and doing. So, okay, before getting to verse 14, Jesus warns his faithful servant to guard against false Jesus teachers, which is the most dangerous thing for church members. It's false Jesus teachers. And we don't like to think about it. And when we come to church, we like to think, hey, we're all friendly. But in all our travels, we need to be on guard against, whether it's the internet, whether it's a videotape, whether it's church, wherever it is, we have to remember that Jesus said in verse 4, he said, take heed, every church member, every faithful servant of mine, take heed that nobody deceives you, and that can include our own selves, deceiving our own selves. So that's the first thing he said. I'm going to answer your questions, then I'm going to give you 66 extra verses, but the first thing I want you to know is you must take heed, full caution. Just like nowadays we have advertising all over the place. You got to protect your house. You've got to buy cameras and connect them up to your cell phone, and you've got to have them connected to the police department. And when the burglar comes, then it's going to set off an alarm, and the police will come and they'll grab him. So you've got to protect yourself. You've got to protect yourself when you're on the internet, so that some Russian doesn't hack your email service or whatever, So he's saying, first and foremost, you need to protect yourself. That's every person's job for themselves. They have to do it. You can't rely on a minister or pastor general or some other person to protect your mind. You have to do it. Okay, verse 5. Because many, that means large numbers, and that means 2 billion people alive today, come to other people in the name, in Jesus' name, in my name, saying that I, Jesus of Nazareth, am the Christ. 2 billion people are saying that, right? The Jesus of Nazareth is the anointed one. They will come using my name. They will come saying, I, Jesus, am the Christ. And those people, those many people, will deceive many people, right? And you might notice in the handout there, I've got the white horse, false Jesus teachers. So if you look closely in the next few verses, verse 5, 6, and 7, you might be able to see the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in what he starts out saying, because it's repeated then again in Revelation in different language. Verse 6, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end that you're asking about, the end is not yet. Just because there are wars and rumors of wars, that's not a strong sign that the end is any time real soon. Verse 7, for nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, which is what the black horse is, and pestilences, which is what the pale horse is, and earthquakes in various places. Matthew 24:8. All these are the beginning, and I looked up the Greek there, means commencement. The commencement of sorrows or travail. Well, when did they begin? The Roman Empire pretty much had everybody under control in Jesus' day. Pax Romana, isn't that what they called it, if you remember your history? Essentially, the Roman Empire had so much power and control, there was peace in the whole Roman Mediterranean world, because if you started a war, the Romans would come and clobber you, right? So at that time there was peace. But then there would come wars and rumors of wars. Verse 9 shows a shift to a more imminent time period. In verse 9 he says, then, meaning now we're shifting from what I just said, they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you. Right? This is the second time period in this discussion. The latter days mostly, but it can apply at other times. You will be hated of all nations for my name's sake. Now I've heard church people say, that's us. My neighbors hate me. It's like, well, I don't see how anybody can say, everybody in every nation hates me. Everybody in every nation doesn't know I exist. They don't know you exist. Right? They don't know what you believe. They can't tell what you believe. They don't want to know what you believe. Right? So, but there comes a time in the latter days when you will be hated of all nations for my name's sake, because you believe what I've been saying. Now, why will this happen? Luke gives a close-up view of this in Luke 6:22. Blessed are you when men hate you, when they exclude you and revile you, and cast your name as evil because of the Son of Man's sake. So, because you're loyal and faithful and true to Jesus Christ, they call you vile, right? Now that may have happened a couple of times in your church life, right? But it's not all nations doing that to you. It's not yet. We haven't reached that point yet. Luke 6:23. Rejoice in that day, says Jesus, and leap for joy. And I am convinced that for the older people in God's church, he means spiritually inside your heart, leap for joy. He doesn't mean go outside and leap off the balcony and, because you just might sprain an ankle or you might hurt yourself more serious than that. For indeed your reward is great in heaven. Now, Revelation reveals why the world will see and hate the true gospel people. Revelation 11:4. These are the two olive trees of the two lampstands. If anyone wants to harm them, fire proceeds out of their mouth, like back in the Old Testament with Elijah, right? And devours their enemies. If anyone wants to harm them, they must be killed in this manner. This isn't happening now, hasn't started yet. The two witnesses are not obvious yet. Verse 6, these two, the two witnesses, have power to shut heaven, so no rain, right? It falls in the days of their prophecy, kind of like the prophets of old days. And they have power over the waters to turn them to blood, like the prophets, like Moses of the old days, right, in the Old Testament, to strike the earth with all plagues as often as they do, because people are wicked and people don't pay attention to what God wrote in the Bible. Okay, so then Satan kills them. In Revelation, you can read this, verse 9, then those from the nations will see their dead bodies, two witnesses' dead bodies, 3.5 days, lying in the streets, and they will not allow their dead bodies to be put into graves, because they hated these two prophets so much, they want to watch their bodies decay. This happened back in World War II to a degree, when they killed Mussolini, wasn't it, in Italy? I think they hung him in a square and then left him there for days so that the birds would eat him, and they just hated him so much they wanted to see his dead, decomposing body in the elements. So Revelation 11:10, then those who dwell on earth will rejoice over them. Okay, so did the people on earth hate the two witnesses? Well, they obviously did, because now they're dead and their dead bodies are lying in the street, and the people are rejoicing over this because this is really great, because now they're dead. They're not tormenting us any longer, and they will make merry and send gifts. Now, a lot of people tell me that this happens at Christmas time, but if you read it slower, it says, those who dwell on earth will rejoice over them, meaning them being dead and their dead bodies lying in the street. So, what is it that makes them merry? It's the dead bodies. It's not eggnog, right? It's not Christmas time that makes them merry. It's looking at their dead bodies that makes them merry, right? And what do merry people normally do in the season of merriness? Is they give gifts, right? I'm not saying it can't happen at Christmas time, but I really don't think it will, right? And send gifts to one another, because these two prophets who tormented them are now dead. So they hate the two prophets, right? The two witnesses. And if you will tell people, we've seen a little bit of this, right? Like people who told other people that they voted for Trump have had their tires slashed. They've had bad things happen to them. They've been kicked out of school, So in this case, with the two witnesses preaching for 3.5 years on global television and now on your cell phones, right? And if you say, well, that's what God says in the Bible, they're speaking God's truth, and the vast majority of the people on the earth can't believe God's truth. They believe Christmas is God's truth instead of Feast of Tabernacles is God's truth. They're just drunk, they're mixed up, they're confused in their minds, and they don't understand. So the world suffers the two witnesses' plagues and hates them, and also those who call them God's prophets. So this basically divides all the people on the planet into two camps. Those who believe these are the two witnesses and what they are preaching is this gospel being preached into all the world, or those that hate you and the two prophets, and that's the two camps, right? Because the beast power will be active at this time, and most people will receive the mark of the beast, and they will worship the beast, and they'll be able to buy and sell, and their life will be normal, and the others will have to go hide in the mountains or something, right? Verse 10 shows this hatred period to be a very ugly time. Verse Matthew 24:10, and then the hatred period, many will be offended. How many of you can see church members being offended if the whole world hates them? How many of you love to be hated? It's not a fun thing, right? You don't even want it from one person. You don't want one person hating you. If all nations are hating you, there's a chance you might get offended. It says many in the church will be offended and will betray one another and will hate one another. So expect a lot of hatred coming up in the years ahead. Matthew 24:11. Then many false prophets will rise up and will deceive many. And the great false prophet who can call down fire from heaven, like Elijah did. Anybody who knows Old Testament Elijah, they'll go, well, look, he's doing exactly the same thing as Elijah did back in the Old Testament. He's calling down fire from heaven. He must be God's servant. No, he's the false prophet, and we're told about it ahead of time. Matthew 24:12. Because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. I think that's happening now. Lawlessness is running amok in Washington, D.C. and lots of places. So the first thumbnail sketch by Jesus of the end of the age finishes this way, Matthew 24:13. But he's about to finish this first little question and answer session. He says in verse 13, before he gets to verse 14, but let me tell you, says Jesus, he, the true servants of God, he or she who endure to the end of their life, right, or the end of the age. Now, if you die in the tribulation, you need to endure to the end of your life. If you stay alive till the end of the tribulation and the end of the age, then you need to endure to the end, because right at the very end, you rise up in the air to meet Christ in the clouds, and while you're doing that, you die. Right? It's a fun death. It's one of those rare fun deaths where you leave the planet and suddenly you're no longer flesh and blood and bone. Suddenly you're a spirit being body and you feel like Superman on steroids. Right? It's going to be a great feeling. But most people will most 2,000 years worth of people have already died. They've been reading these verses and then they died. Chester read these verses and he passed. And so he won't be in the tribulation. He read these, he looked to them, but he doesn't have to experience them because he's waiting in the grave. Okay, Matthew 24:14. This gospel shall be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then shall the end come. This is the true seventh day, seventh festival gospel. Okay, so that answers pretty much the first question they asked. One of the first two questions they were asking. Revelation also shows the end happens at the start of the seventh trumpet. 11:11, Revelation 11:11 says, now after 3.5 days, the breath of life from God, so obviously God's involved, enters these two dead bodies, two witnesses, and they stood on their feet. The second woe, verse 14, is past. Behold, the third woe is coming quickly. If you checked your 7 trumpets, the first woe and the second woe are the trumpets number 5 and 6. And the third woe is trumpet number 7. So it says, when the two witnesses rise up into the air, into the clouds, the second woe is finished, the third woe is coming quickly, and the next verse, verse 15 says, and then the 7th angel sounded. That's the appearance of Jesus Christ in the sky. So the 3 golden keys are explained in the 3 Matthew 25 parables. So it wasn't like, I'm going to be dead in 3 days, I've given a whole bunch of parables. Oh, there's 3 parables I forgot to give. Why don't I just stick them in at the end of these 2 questions that I'm answering? No, the whole thing is a package, and it's a warning against being tricked into by deception, and on the other hand, being ready, found so doing, at the end of your life. But before that, Jesus wanted to answer these questions, and the end of the age comes at the completion of the gospel of the kingdom preaching and the rising of the 2 dead bodies and the sounding of the 7th trump, or, as Jesus said in Matthew 24:14, this gospel is going to be preached powerfully. So powerfully we're going to be hated for it, right? Into all the world as a witness to all nations, and then comes